Hello and welcome to this webinar presented by BSI, the UK's national standards body, on the subject of the EU referendum and the UK's future role in developing European standards. This webinar was recorded on the 8th of July 2016, and I'm David Bell, the Director of Standards Policy at BSI. Alongside me is Dr. Scott Steedman, BSI's Director of Standards, and Richard Collin, BSI's National and European Policy Manager. So the objective of this webinar is to explain BSI's view of the future relationship between the UK and European standards in light of the result of the referendum on the 23rd, 24th of June. We will be running this webinar in four parts. Firstly, we'll introduce BSI as the UK's national standards body and explain the UK's involvement in European standards. Then we'll talk about the possible outcomes of the EU referendum result. We'll talk about BSI's view and what BSI believes we can achieve for our stakeholders. And then thirdly, we'll speak about what BSI is doing now in terms of our communications on this subject. And finally, we look for your input. Your views are very important to help us to shape that position. And so we look forward to hearing from you. There is an email address, live@bsigroup.com, to submit any questions you may have. Many of you have already submitted questions, and we hope to get to as many of those as possible during today's webinar. So before we start, Scott, you've written already to our committee members, but I think it's probably worth just reiterating where we are today. It's been 2 interesting weeks.
Certainly has, David, and hello everyone. I thought I'd just start really by talking a little bit about BSI's role as the UK national standards body. Just a range of viewers watching this webinar. So just to kick off by emphasising that role. Every country in the world has one national standards body, and BSI is appointed by UK government to fulfil that function on your behalf and to be the UK member of CEN and CENELEC. So we are responsible for providing that infrastructure for UK experts to participate in international, European and national standards making activity, and for representing UK economic and societal interests in all of those activities. So our national policy is to influence the development of industry standards that are recognised internationally and adopted in the UK and many other countries as the way of defining good practice, whatever that is, a technical specification, a business practice, or simply a statement of principles. And the intention is that really by getting the world to adopt our ideas wherever we can and promoting one single standard on any given issue, we simplify the market structure for trade, for innovation and growth. The standards that our experts develop through our standards making process contain knowledge which is used by the market and embody good practice, and they are consensus based and they are voluntary. So we do have viewers who may be unfamiliar with the principle of standards and might think that there's something to do with regulations. Just let me explain with a couple of examples perhaps how standards are used in this way. So just imagine Company A buying products and services from its supply chain which it's using as part of its offering to the market. Company A needs those products and services to meet its expectations, and it shares those expectations with its suppliers by quoting the relevant standards that it wants the suppliers to follow. It's a voluntary matter for the supplier to do that or to go and seek business elsewhere. You might also imagine that a government regulator wants to ensure that a certain type of product on the market is safe. The regulator refers to an industry standard as a means of compliance with the regulation. Companies can choose whether to use the standard and be deemed compliant or to show their compliance in some other way. So standards are a very efficient way of sharing information between governments, between industry and consumers over what good looks like. So BSI, as the national standards body in the UK, we have a structure of over 1,200 committees and working groups made up of over 11,000 people, business experts, government representatives, testing bodies, consumer reps, academics, environmental groups, trades unions and so on. And we thank you all for your support. We couldn't do this activity without the input of our committee members.
Absolutely. And Richard, if I can bring you in there, of course these 11,000 experts, they're not just working on British homegrown standards.
David, absolutely, that's quite right. In fact, the vast majority of the British standards that the experts are working on are in fact European or international standards. Some 95% of the standards are European or international standards, and those are British standards, but they come from and they're working with in Europe or with international standards through ISO and IEC. Often and preferably they're both European and international, and then adopted as the British standard. These days we've got a much reduced national only programme of standards. And this, in fact, is a positive thing because our business is operating in an interconnected world, and they need interconnected standards to do that. So the European standards that come from Senelec, and Senelec are two of the European standards organisations that develop European standards in all fields other than telecommunications. Their standards are developed by committees where any member country can participate through their national standards body. BSI is a major player in this, in European standards development and in international standards development. So, for example, in Europe, BSI experts, UK experts, make up over 500 committee chairs and working group conveners.
Yeah, and it's really, really important that we do that because it reflects the markets in which UK businesses are operating, both in European countries and around the world. They need standards to help them trade with that minimum fuss between their counterparts around the globe. No additional cost from producing variants for different markets, no additional testing costs. So good for business, good for consumers.
And BSI's membership of those organisations, just to be really clear right at the start, our membership of SEN and Senelec continues as it does today, because we've had questions in already. One of our committee members from Morphy Richards has asked, will Senelec and SEN have the power to exclude GB experts from their committees? So let's just nail that immediately, that BSI continues to be a member of SEN and Senelec.
Yes, absolutely. Our position is that it is absolutely business as usual for BSI. Our commitment to the European system, to our colleagues and participation is undiminished, and our work internationally will not be distracted by the discussions that we're now ongoing.
So let's look at the European standards system and how it functions in some more detail. Scott, let's talk about the single standard model.
Thank you, David. So the European standards system is based on a single standard model. When SEN and Senelec adopt a European standard, all their national member standardisation bodies, that's us, 33 countries, must do two things. They must adopt that standard identically, and they must withdraw any national standard that conflicts with it. People may not realise, but actually BSI withdraws about 1,500 standards a year because they're superseded, conflicting, or being revised. So that system has been very, very effective across the single market. It has reduced the number of standards that business might have to use across 33 countries over the decades from 160,000 to just about 19,000. And it means that across the 33 member countries, just one single standard for any given topic or application where industry needs to have good practice guidance.
And those 33 countries, it's broader than the EU. We should be clear that it includes all of the EU members, it includes the EFTA countries as well, and also Turkey and indeed the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia is a member of those.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really important. The single standard model in these 33 countries is the only such market structure in the world, and it permits full reciprocity of market access across those 33 countries, broader than the EU, and enables a simple market structure in those countries, again, good for consumers. It also means that UK experts have a significant say on the standards that are used throughout Europe, throughout that single market. So this single standard model is a response of industry, if you like, to the political ambition of having a common trading market throughout many countries.
But they're not the regulations, and I know that the audience today is more than just BSI's committee members. So let's just talk a little about the difference really between, or how indeed these standards fit with regulation in the EU and the single market. Richard.
Sure. It's a very interesting question because we've talked about how standards are industry documents, therefore business and society. But also there are instances in which standards are used to work with regulation, and it's in Europe it's something just under 20% of European standards that are used in conjunction with regulation to give a means of compliance with legislation. So the European standards organisations have been given in European law the privilege to develop European standards, and those European standards, and only those European standards, can be used by the European Union to say this helps to comply with regulation. And this happens when industry agrees, through the leadership of the standards bodies, that they will develop the standards that the European Union needs. Mm-hmm. And of most of those standards that meet public policy or used to meet public policy objectives, they're what we call harmonised standards. And the terminology is quite important and can be sometimes confused. So harmonised standards are standards requested by the European Commission and developed by one of the three European standards organisations for the purposes of harmonisation legislation. And this forms part of the regulatory technique that goes back to the mid-1980s, called the new approach, and now often called the new legislative framework. So in this model, the EU makes legislation that sets a harmonised requirement right across the EU. But the technique is that the requirements in the legislation are kept to the minimum, kept to what we call essential requirements. And then in addition to that, you have standards that give a technical expression to those essential requirements. So to take an example of the toys, there's a European Toy Safety Directive, which is implemented into the legislation of all members. And that says toys must be safe. So they must not pose a risk of strangulation. They must be sufficiently mechanically strong, and any moving parts the risk from moving parts must also be minimised. And that's what it says. In order for manufacturers to know what that really means, then we have a standard, EN 71, with all of its different parts, that explains what is the limit for the quantity of lead in paint, or how fast a ride-on toy should go. And that gives industry's expectation of what good practice is in terms of safety and so on. And the relationship with this standard to the law is that this standard still remains voluntary. The manufacturer does not have to use the standard, but if they do, then they benefit from a presumption of conformity because the reference of the standard is published in the EU's official journal. So there is a link in some cases between standard and the regulation, but there is still a separation. There's still the difference between mandatory legislation and voluntary standard.
Yeah, I think it's worth just reiterating that point, because I appreciate that many people who are on the call today are BSI's committee members. You'll be very familiar, I'm sure, with the new approach and the way the standards fit with regulation, but others who are on the call on this webinar won't be, so we wanted just to go back over that. So Scott, this is really crucial, isn't it, to say that we're separate, because we've had a lot of questions already saying you're not part of the EU, why are we having this webinar?
What's this got to do with the EU? So it's crucial to emphasise that CEN and CENELEC are separate from the European Union. They are independent, private associations. For me, they are the cooperative bodies that help the 33 countries work together to make industry standards with a wide societal input. The EU works with the European standard system, recognises its benefits, and has made a law which governs the relationship between the EU and the European standard system. But ultimately, CEN and CENELEC, through their expert committees, led by one or other member at national level, it's not led from Brussels, it's not led by CEN or CENELEC, it's led by a member of CEN and CENELEC. They enable the market players to cooperate to develop a single standard to serve business and societal interests in that market of 33 countries. So the European standards system is put to use in facilitating regulatory compliance in a minority of cases, but this does not reflect the true business purpose of the standards themselves, which is to support that reciprocity of market access. So no conflicting standards anywhere, a very simple, efficient market structure.
And people who are not in those committees, but they will be familiar with things like structural Eurocodes, alarm systems, personal protective equipment, playground equipment for children, all of which are covered by European standards committees.
Yeah, many thousands of UK experts represent industry, consumers, government. They all participate in these working groups to shape those codes, guidance or specifications which are then used in the UK and internationally. Our policy is to influence the international standard first. Indeed, that is the European policy, is for European experts to cooperate to shape the global standard, and if necessary, to bring it into Europe and adopt it here. But we only create European standards where there's a particular European requirement, maybe something special about the European countries that we need a special standard for. Our priority is to make the global standard.
So let's bring this first section to a close. To summarise, the European standard system supports EU regulation, but it is much broader than the EU. It's mainly for industry though, and that's industry and society. We need to make that quite clear. But the single standard model enables reciprocal market access across all 33 countries.
And I'll just stress at that point that we don't expect anything to change in the short term. So as I said earlier, it's business as usual for all of us. We are a full member of those European standards organisations, CEN and CENELEC, as we've discussed. Our activity with regard to policy engagement, commitment to our responsibilities as a member of those organisations, completely unchanged. Indeed, we're stepping up our communications with our partners, and barring surprises, I intend to continue to fulfil my full term as a Vice President of CEN to the end of 2017. Our relationship with the international standards organisations, ISO and IEC, and our membership of ETSI remains exactly the same, and we don't expect any changes in that area in the future.
Yeah, and we've had a question that's come in using the email address live@bsigroup.com from Ross Newman about that exact point. Will we still be taking on secretariats for European technical committees during the Article 50 process, or even after we've left the EU? And I think we're going to come on and talk about the fact that we are continuing our membership and how that's
Nothing changes.
Nothing changes. Just one point to make before we move on. Some of you will be familiar with the fact that BSI is also one of the EU notified bodies. So that's an authorised body that can can carry out CE marking and product certification and medical devices. It's business as usual for that part of BSI's activities as well. We're not here today to talk specifically about that, although there have been some questions about what this means for CE marking, which we'll explain the answer to later on. So if I may, let's move on now to Brexit and to the results of the EU referendum. We won't recap the results. We assume that you're all fully up to speed with what happened. Clearly, the UK's departure from the EU will require new relationships between the UK and the European single market. We've heard a lot about different arrangements that might be put in place. Maybe, Richard, you could just take us through some of those arrangements and how they could impact on us as and our standards activity.
Certainly, David, thank you. We did a bit of work prior to the referendum looking at different possible scenarios and the possible relationships between the UK and the EU in the event of Brexit. And we came up with 4 possible arrangements that could be envisaged. I don't intend to run through these in any detail. There's a document on our website which actually has the scenarios that we envisaged and what these mean specifically for BSI's membership of CEN and CENELEC. And that will remain there for a while, noting that it is a pre-referendum document, but it has all of the details of the scenarios. But of these 4 scenarios, they range from the situation where the UK remains a member of the European Economic Area, as now, in a similar way to Norway and Iceland, through the idea of a new negotiated arrangement for parts of the single market, negotiated arrangement between the UK and the EU, which is something completely different and hasn't been done in that way before, to the far further end, which is towards the idea of what they would call a WTO only model, which would be more like New Zealand, where the UK is trading with the EU as a complete third country, facing tariffs and quotas and so on as appropriate. So these different options actually have an impact on BSI's continued membership of CEN and CENELEC, bearing in mind that we are business as usual for the moment. In the scenarios where where the UK continues as a member of the European Economic Area, or in EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, then there is no issue. BSI can continue as a full member of CEN and CENELEC. In scenarios that are different to that, where, for example, there is a new type of negotiated agreement, then the position is slightly different, and it would require BSI to discuss with the other European national standards bodies to come up with an agreement on changing the statutes of CEN and CENELEC to permit continued membership. You go all the way through to a more extreme situation where that gradually becomes more and more difficult, you would imagine, to have that negotiation as the UK gets further away from the single market.
So so if the UK stays in EFTA or the EEA, or joins EFTA I should say, in the EEA, there's no change, nothing to talk about then. But if the relationship changes, what is BSI's position? Would we want to retain the UK's membership of CEN and CENELEC?
Yes, absolutely. We would want to retain full membership of CEN and CENELEC for lots of good reasons. and that's very much our ambition. The fundamental principles I referred to earlier about adoption and withdrawal are at the heart of this issue here. So we are committed, we have a history now, decades of consistent single standards and regulatory requirements operating in the UK and other European countries, and that provides a very strong base from which to move forward and to retain that membership, provided that we are committed to a single standard model in the UK and the adoption and withdrawal of conflicting standards. We see considerable benefits in retaining the single standard model in the UK. That reciprocity of market access is at the heart of the relationship within the 33 countries, access to the largest integrated tariff-free market in the world. Indeed, the independent economic studies, we did a study published last year by CEBR, commissioned by BSI, said that having the same standard across borders is a major catalyst for trade, providing confidence and a common trading language, lowering production costs and reducing barriers to trade. So, possibility of exploiting economies of scale. So there are economic arguments for a single standard model as well. But critically, it means that UK experts, if we're full members of CEN and CENELEC, can continue to have influence over the content of the business standards, the vast majority of which are being used in a voluntary way by business to business. We can continue to influence the development and use of those standards. Outside CEN and CENELEC membership, that influence would be lost. So where standards engage with regulation, the European standards organisations are the only bodies that can develop European standards that support compliance with the European regulation. By remaining full members of CEN and CENELEC, we remain part of that discussion as well, able to influence those standards that are being used in the support of future European regulation. So whether we like it or not, businesses are working within a regulatory framework, they're using standards to trade. Our industry will need to meet the European legal requirements in order to trade with the EU, or indeed to trade in the UK, because they will be seeking international products and services to support their own work here in the UK. Those products and services will be using European standards and meeting European regulations. So post-Brexit, the UK look more to international trade, but again, if we're at the table in CEN and CENELEC as full members, we have a say in which international standards are also adopted as European standards, that being our first choice in terms of national policy. We've seen the benefit of the single standard model. We're keen to export this beyond Europe, and other countries in the world are moving in that direction. We can think of initiatives in Africa towards creating single standard models, and countries like Canada where they're moving in that direction as well. So this concept of a single internationalized standard and not having a fragmented market structure, fundamental to the future of the UK post-Brexit.
Okay, so notwithstanding the economic benefit studies that have been carried out, which show the benefits of staying in, what we're hearing from one or two of our committee members, and it is a minority, they're saying, yes, we'd still like to retain those European standards. However, there is a particular European standard or a couple of European standards that we don't like. Can we withdraw those and replace them with the old British standard, the old homegrown British standard? So they want a sort of pick and choose model. So where does BSI stand on that proposal?
Well, very simply really, you can't be half in and half out. You can't say, well, we'll take the European standards in this sector, but we don't like the ones in that sector, and we're going to have additional British standards. I mean, maybe lower safety requirements or maybe higher safety requirements. You can't have it both ways. And the reason is, if I give an example, perhaps you could imagine that the UK and Norway might create a new standard for smart refrigerators, perhaps, including standards of performance and interoperability. But if there were then a European standard developed for smart refrigerators, which had a conflicting requirement, perhaps it was suggesting better energy performance for this smart refrigerator, then you've got a problem now, because you've got the UK and Norway with its hypothetical smart refrigerator standard and a European standard coming along. And it's got better energy performance or some different characteristic to it. So at that point, Norway and the UK in this example become a backdoor. So once a product is in the single market, it is free to be traded anywhere in the single market. And you can't have a backdoor where one country in the single market has different standards to another. because that would open the door to products being circulated which were not consistent with the European standards that are being used everywhere else. So no back door. So we've no plans to bring back old British standards because that would be creating additional burdens for our own industry. We would be complicating and fragmenting our own market structures.
Is it worth just reminding people, because I know we have a slide, of how that interaction happens between international standards and national standards?
So in this diagram, we're trying to set out the standards landscape. I suggested that you should see standards as enablers for business and industry. They are knowledge of good practice. BSI, in its role as the national standards body, is responsible for everything in the red zone of this diagram. That's to say our work on international standards, our work on regional standards, our work on British standards, national standards, and indeed the sponsored standards, the fast track that we call a PAS standard. Very useful in terms of promoting British business practice to the world, either into Europe or into the global sphere. But we're not responsible for what's in the blue bands towards the lower bottom of this slide. These are all the private consortia standards, the technical standards that companies sometimes have, their own private standards, or the very useful professional codes, guidance, best practice documents that professional institutions produce. But our ambition as a standards body supporting UK industry is to see a coherent and consistent set of knowledge. We don't want any knowledge in this pyramid to be conflicting or overlapping with anything else, because that simply confuses the market and makes it difficult for business to trade. So lots of important knowledge in here. BSI is responsible for a part of the information that is used by business and industry in the UK, but by no means all. There's extremely useful and important knowledge and consensus and indeed standards used elsewhere in the market structure, developed and maintained by other organisations.
Okay, so for all of those reasons, BSI will be striving, our ambition will be to retain full membership of Sen and Senelec, and I think we're heartened by the number of emails that we've had in since we issued that statement to committee members, confirming that it's also their view and their hope as well. So maybe we just have a look at a few questions that we received in advance on BSI's membership of Sen and Senelec, and please continue to submit questions using the email address live@bsigroup.com. They are being fed through to us. So firstly, we've grouped together some questions because they're all in a very similar area, but I feel we really should name check the organisations. So thank you to the Mineral Products Association, to the Construction Products Association, the Welding Institute, Exova and others who've asked a variety of questions about BSI's membership and what will happen if Article 50 is formally submitted. And particularly the question, will we maintain our input irrespective of the separation of the UK and the EU? And Richard, we've heard there that BSI's ambition is to remain a full member.
Yes, absolutely, and that's where what we're aiming for. That we continue with full membership of Sen and Senelec, and that might, in some circumstances, require a change to the Sen and Senelec statutes that we would work on in that situation. Of course, we have to wait and see exactly what the political settlement is to see where this goes. But nevertheless, we can maintain the ambition that's for full membership of Sen and Senelec, and that enables our experts to continue to play a full role in the development of European standards.
And we've had a few questions in about the extent to which the UK experts may lose influence in the process. Now, obviously, this is very difficult to measure or to say with any certainty what will happen, but certainly the National Energy Foundation and International Fire Consultants Limited have asked questions about, are we going to get frozen out of leadership positions? Is there going to be some reluctance to take the UK view on board? How do you see that playing out, Scott or Richard?
It's a very good question, because influence is something that's can be quite intangible. But in terms of the relationship with Sen and Senelec committees, then the essential thing is, first of all, to continue with the full participation and full commitment. And it's through that full commitment and participation that our experts demonstrate again, and continue to demonstrate, their value to the whole of the process. And as long as we continue in that way, then any loss of influence I would imagine will be a temporary loss of influence.
Yeah.
There is some uncertainty, that's
Yeah.
very clear. We all feel that
Yeah.
in international meetings. But this should be a temporary thing because we go back to proving the value of the UK
Yeah.
expertise that we've proved over many years.
And we have in our communications suggested that if anybody has any experiences which are negative or insinuating or implying that something's changed, then we will address that very directly ourselves. I mean, my recommendation really is that it's your commitment to continuing to deliver, develop, maintain, manage, revise, update the standards that are needed for your industry that will be the most important aspect of maintaining influence. Wavering at this moment or stepping back or thinking one doesn't need to go to meetings anymore isn't going to help the cause. So in terms of our capacity to maintain our full membership of Sen and Senelec, your commitment is a key part of that.
And a couple of questions that have come in. Alan Sellers asks about if the UK does move to what he describes as the extreme end of WTO only trade agreements, would BSI seek to continue to use EN standards for simplicity's sake? And I think our view is really clear on that.
We have no doubt. I mean, UK business and industry would still require to use EN standards. And if for some political reason we ended up in a situation where we had no influence over those, that would be unfortunate. But there's no doubt that British business and industry will still be using European standards and would still need access to those standards. So we would provide that.
And a lot of you have asked today and before about the impact that Brexit might have on the use of English language in European standards. And certainly we don't see any change, and I'm sure our Irish colleagues would agree with us on that. We expect still English language to be the basis for Sen and Senelec. It is their working language.
Yes, and bear in mind that, I mean, in the Senelec case, 80% of their standards come from IEC work anyway at that global level where the language is English. So it would seem slightly surprising to me that we would start to be making standards in a language other than English, notwithstanding the fact that many countries in Europe anyway work in English as the normal business language.
Okay, let's look now at the next part of the webinar where we look at the communications that BSI is putting out. So Scott, talk us through the actions that BSI has already taken and what's planned.
Well, David, thanks. Since the result was announced, we've taken immediate steps to really ramp up our communications with all our stakeholders, and there are some important messages to go out. The very first message that I sent out went to all our European Committee chairmen and conveners of working groups. That was 566 of those individuals, and we've also written to all our committee members, 11,000 of you, and the most active of our nominating organisations. These are trade associations and other organisations who put forward experts, about 60 of them. I've written to all of my opposite numbers in the other 32 countries of the Sen and Senelec European Standard System, and we will be in touch with ISO and IEC to confirm to them that none of this will distract us from our commitments to the global stage and other national standards bodies. We've had specific discussions with China already last week, who were here for a bilateral meeting, and indeed in Austria too. So we'll be back in touch with you as things develop, try and keep all our stakeholders informed. We have a website which we've created with a question and answer section, and all of your questions will be answered, grouped and structured, and we will keep that populated. So we hope that as a result of this webinar and your questions flooding in, Richard helpfully manning our help desk, if you like, we will have a central place for that. We've got a central email address for questions, which is europeanpolicy@bsigroup.com, and Richard will be managing that. So we've also, as we're articulating today, developed a policy position, the single standard policy position, to protect the UK domestic market as well as the UK international market, and we've tried to set out today that, and we welcome your contributions on how we might refine it in future. We'll be publicising that view going forward and discussing it with our stakeholders. I'll be discussing the whole subject with the Presidential Committee of Sen and Senelec, where I'm a Vice President, of course, in their governance groups in the autumn, so we'll be taking it forward with our members, colleagues there. And perhaps as importantly, perhaps most importantly of all, we're working with UK government very closely now within BIS and other departments to provide them with the assistance that they will need as they prepare for any future negotiations.
And I think we've also reached out to the devolved administrations, particularly in Scotland.
Yes, absolutely right. Very important to think about the UK domestic structure as well, because fragmentation of the UK domestic standards environment would be very bad for our SMEs and business and indeed consumers throughout the UK. So I have written to the First Minister in Scotland as well, offering our support to her for her expert group to make sure they're fully informed about this standards issue.
Okay, let's turn now to some more of the questions that we've had coming in. So don't forget live@bsigroup.com to submit any further questions or any if you have any need for any clarification about what's been said during the webinar. A lot of people have been asking questions about funding and the level of EU funding of the European system and what impact that will have on BSI and the funding that BSI receives from the European Commission.
Yeah.
Should we just be really clear about that funding and what it is? And
yeah, I think we can knock that one on the head quite easily. BSI gets no EU funding for its standards development work. And indeed, interesting also just to reflect that in terms of CEN, as a European standards organisation, less than 30% of its funding is from the EU, and that's for standards development work. And in CENELEC, the figure is less than 20%. So in fact, the EU is not a funder in any significant way of European standards development work. The vast bulk of the cost of standards development is, of course, borne by the industries, the experts, the companies and associations and the individuals who participate in that activity. That's where the big engine is. So we don't get any EU funding for our standards development work.
Okay, so that won't impact it. And Richard, also there's been some questions about AITs, so you'll be familiar with the fact that the UK government provides funding under its Assisted International Travel Scheme, whereby our principal experts and committee chairs can claim a small amount of funding towards their costs. It's not a huge amount, but it does go a long way to helping the UK to participate in international European standards. Do we see any change in that funding arrangement?
Well, ultimately, that funding arrangement is what the government, UK government, provides, and so we have to wait and see what they do. But nevertheless, we're committed to trying to keep AITs at the level that it is now, to continue supporting experts' participation, because of course this is very important, and we recognise that it is difficult. So our commitment is to try to keep AITs at the same level. We have to speak to government about what they intend to do.
Yeah.
Let's just look at some of the other questions that we've had coming in, and we must thank Martin Hardwick, who's the General Secretary of the Engineered Panels in Construction Limited, who submitted a lot of very sensible questions, one of which is around the need that product manufacturers may have to create two product lines and or undertake different additional testing to comply with BS and European standards if they begin to separate in terms of content and usability. Now, that's clearly what our ambition doesn't want to happen, because we don't want to see that divergence. But clearly, that for industry, that's a potential and major cost.
Yeah, if British and European standards did begin to diverge, then that is a risk. You can see immediately that if a product manufacturer is trying to meet two different standards requirements because they're selling some products here and some products there, then that's going to be additional costs. And that's one of the really strongest arguments of all for retaining a single standard model, which is industry's expectation. It's about reducing the burden on British business, and that also, because of that commitment, will greatly facilitate our ability to remain a full member of CEN and CENELEC, which is our ambition. So all about reducing the cost to industry and improving the lot of the consumers.
Now, Richard, a lot of people have asked questions about harmonised standards as opposed to non-harmonised, and we've explained already that harmonised is a word that we use advisedly because it's got a very specific definition. You can't imagine a future with two different approaches to those two different types of standard?
No, certainly that's not the position we have now. Harmonised standards are European standards. They're developed through the same processes. There's a different trigger at the start, a trigger coming from the European Commission in this case. But following that, those standards still have to be accepted by the standards bodies. The request has to be accepted by the standards bodies.
By a member?
Yes, indeed, by the members through CEN and CENELEC. And they have to accept it and accept the fact that it is relevant for industry and the society.
And then it's made in exactly the same way.
Indeed, so it is exactly the same process. The difference is that it's a different trigger.
Yeah.
And at the end, when the harmonised standard is completed, the European standard is accepted, and it's put forward to the Commission, then if the Commission accepts it, publishes the references in the official journal, then it has this special status of the presumption of conformity. But there is really no difference. It's not that harmonised standards are regulatory standards or mandatory. Yeah. It's they have a different trigger and a different result of what happens with them after they're developed.
And the key here is this issue of identical regulatory requirements. So in order to achieve reciprocal market access between any two countries anywhere in the world, the issue is that the identical standard is supporting an identical regulatory requirement. Otherwise, it's extremely difficult to avoid divergence.
A question that's coming from our personal protective equipment committees, and thank you to Paul Varnsbury, who's a former chair of PH 312. It's a question really about how does the UK express concerns that we might have about specific European standards, and we already do this, do we not, in the national forwards that we publish alongside the standards. Do you see any change in the future for how we address these concerns that we might have?
No, I don't think so. But provided we're still full member of CENELEC, then that will all work in exactly the same way.
There's a lot of questions coming in about CE marking. Can we just be clear that this is really a question for our regulators, is it not?
Yes, that's right. I mean, anything where it is a reference to the CE marking. The CE marking is a legislative marking. It's required by various European directives and regulations, and it doesn't come from the standards perspective. So it's difficult for us to make many comments about whether regulation will still apply, because that's a matter for the government and the arrangement with the EU.
And can you just elaborate, Richard, while we're on this sort of topic, around how it is that we either have national forwards that say something about this European standard, or we have annexes? How does that come about? Is that because we have different regulation or the same regulation?
No, we have the same regulation, because it's harmonised legislation, and then we adopt the same European standard as a national standard.
Yeah.
But
in the construction sector, for example, there are quite a lot of areas where we've got
specific national annexes. Yes, that is specific to the construction sector, and it is to how the system works in that sector. Normally, it's not the case. There may be occasionally a national forward giving the comments of our national committee on the European standard, but essentially we have to adopt the European standard identically.
Yes, that's right. But it's not universal. I mean, there are lots of examples of standards that have annexes or have forwards, and they have comments on them.
Yeah, and indeed, there are also standards where there are annexes that say this part of this standard cannot apply in this country because there's national regulation.
Right. Yes, that's right.
That's national regulation in addition to the European regulation, which is permitted under the EU treaty in certain circumstances.
Yes.
So there are cases in all the different parts where the position is slightly different.
Yes.
And we have to treat those cases individually.
Yes.
And I don't think that's an argument for abandoning the whole model.
No.
It's an argument for understanding the individual cases.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. But I think, to be clear, what we're saying is those kind of those approaches happen today, so we are clear in our forwards where there are those issues, or whether there's a deviation because of a special national condition or whatever.
Yes.
So essentially,
that's business as usual.
That's business as usual, and that continues.
Yes.
A number of people have asked whether they would see BSI or our members changing their focus over the years ahead to shift more towards putting more resource into the international work programs rather than the European programs. So really shift in focus from CENELEC committees into ISO and IEC committees. How do you see that? How do you see that playing out? Because obviously BSI has also got a lot of bilateral international relations as well, which we can't forget.
Yeah, absolutely, David. So I mean, I'm in very much in listening mode around the industry and the market requirements, and our role, I think, here is to advise industry and business or consumer community what the most appropriate route is for the outcome that they are seeking. So if they are seeking to have a global practice to support something to do with supply chain procurement, for example, then it might be very appropriate either to use a PAS type standard or to go straight into an ISO environment, because you're trying to work at a global space and you've got the 160 plus members of ISO, who many of whom are likely to adopt that standard. So it's very much a kind of horses for courses approach, but I don't see a shift in emphasis from European to global in any way that we're not doing today. We already make standards in collaboration with our strategic partners. I think of China or Germany or other organizations, and we make standards with an ISO and IEC, we make standards in Sensor and ETSI, we make standards ourselves. So all this business will carry on reflecting market interest, industry needs, societal requirements. It's up to our communities to say, this is our ambition, this is the outcome we want, and then we'll try and make it happen.
We've had a question that's just come in from Kevin Evans about how BSI will manage the process if standards do start to diverge. So not just diverging between the UK and Europe, but even some kind of devolved or breakup of the UK or changes in the UK. And I think is our answer there, that's a very good question. How would we? You know, that is by definition adding complexity and burden to industry that wants to trade beyond its local area.
Yeah, I mean the key point here is that as I tried to show in the diagram earlier around the role of the National Standards Body, our function here is to act as a convener of communities to help bring consensus. BSI doesn't write standards, our committee members write standards. So we try to put that community in a room, make sure all stakeholders are represented, achieve a consensus, go through open public consultation, and capture the result in a way that can be maintained in perpetuity. So the governance of a formal standard process is quite rigorous, but it's very much about convening a community. Now, if those communities are saying, well, actually, we've got a specific requirement here and we want a standard for that, then we will do our best to support it. But the basic principle that full stakeholder engagement, open public consultation and consensus will apply, because that is the principles under which our consensus documents are produced. They must involve all stakeholders. Otherwise, you're looking at a small select group of people who are trying to do something to protect themselves or to create some advantage. And a national standards body can't be part of that. They can just do it themselves. And there are examples of that where groups of industry, companies, consortia or others write their own standards and use them. It's a voluntary market.
Okay, well, thank you for the questions that are coming in. We've got far too many to go through, but if I can just pick out one or two that I've just seen. So, thank you to Neeraj Somley, who asks if BSI is aware of any communications that have come from either from government or from BSI itself advising that, or are there cases, I should say, where we've seen manufacturers not wanting to certify their product or to move away from the European standard, almost using Brexit as an opportunity to pick and choose the bits of regulation that they comply with. I've certainly not seen anything, and I don't think certainly BSI wouldn't issue any statements to that effect.
No, we wouldn't. For the reasons I've just tried to articulate, it's very much in the interest of the UK domestic market that we retain a single standard within the UK domestic market. So fragmentation within the UK domestic market, whether that was to do with regional or sector-specific issues, would be a negative, because it is immediately, you can see the problem, immediately restricting markets to certain groups or communities, causing added cost and complexity. So if people are seeking to do, on the one hand, something different to a single standard, and on the other hand, they have to do that anyway for some other market, that's just bringing complexity. So we've not had any examples of that. Industry almost universally is saying, please simplify the system. Remember that we withdraw 1,500 standards a year. Simplifying the system is a big part of what we're trying to achieve.
A lot of questions about what level of support BSI plans to give to SEN and SENELEC TC chairmen and conveners. I think we can say quite categorically that BSI has no plans to change the level of support we give. Yeah. Quite the opposite. These are tricky times, and we will be offering as much support as we can through this process. Yeah. And certainly from the policy team in BSI, we've made the offer already to colleagues running those committees that we stand ready to attend any of your meetings that you have over the next couple of years to try to explain Brexit and what it means and what it doesn't mean and what BSI's position is. And I think it's worth us just restating that for
yeah,
this
absolutely.
audience.
I mean, in terms of our team within the knowledge solutions area, that is unchanged, and we will continue to provide every level of support we possibly can in terms of development of products for the use of standards, in terms of developments for standards activity itself, the committee structures, the resourcing. That is all completely unchanged and will remain unchanged in the future. We are very, very committed to supporting UK interests in this very important activity. Indeed, I feel quite strongly that actually in the situation we now find ourselves in, the business standards, industry standards part of the market landscape is now absolutely centre stage for the UK economy and for government, industry and societal interests to reflect on. We are very much in the focus now in terms of being able to enable future opportunities for UK to trade successfully internationally and to maintain its own internal domestic market.
You mentioned opportunities there, Scott. Maybe we should just look at the opportunities from Brexit and what else we can do. And I want to thank Mike Graham of UK Value Management, who's asked a series of really interesting questions, and we will try and answer them all on the FAQs that you'll find on the website. But one of the questions he asked was specifically about opportunities that might come out of Brexit. How do you see those?
Well, I don't see any specific opportunities that you can point to and say, oh, that's great. You know, people have suggested, oh, well, maybe if you weren't in Senelec, somehow you'd be doing something else. And the answer is no. The answer is that BSI and the National Standards Body function supporting UK industry, business, government, society is already doing all of these things. So we are working in Sen and Senelec as full members because it's in the interests of UK trading across 33 countries. But we are also working in ISO and IEC, we are working in ETSI, we are working directly making our British standards and PAS standards which are being used around the world. And you can think of lots of good examples of that. Asset management is one of them. The building information modelling standards, which are called PAS 1192, very successfully stimulated by UK government, now being used globally. So these opportunities are all coming because the market is aspiring to them. Got a lot of excellent work with Innovate UK now in new and emerging technologies, in governance and leadership, in organisational resilience. We've got work with our strategic partners bilaterally, working with China, for example. We have a special standardisation cooperation commission with China between the UK and China that sits under the Joint Economic Trade Committee, and that activity is working on new areas like civil nuclear energy, graphene, smart cities. China has adopted the UK smart city standards directly as Chinese national standards in the last few months. We work with our colleagues in Germany on Industry 4.0 and automation, Japan on aging society, and so on. So all of these opportunities happening today because that's what people want. And when we go to those countries, they want to work with UK experts because we are nimble, because we're agile, and because we're very much thought leaders in the space of good business practice. So we're seen as that type of a standards body anyway. We are a global standards organisation now, today. But we have to have this work in Europe because it's so important to UK trade and prosperity. But internationally, we're already doing an awful lot, and I'm sure we will continue to do that.
And the internal regulations of Sen and Senelec, Richard, don't allow any kind of prejudice against any of the members, and so BSI as a full member, we should be able to ensure our experts have full access to everything that goes on.
Exactly, and that's the case now when we're business as usual. The internal regulations don't prejudice in any way those experts from Iceland and Norway who are fully involved. We have officers of Sen and Senelec who are from the non-EU members, former recent president of Senelec, and so on. So there is no difference between the non-EU and the EU members, and that's really critical to emphasise the difference between the European standards system and the EU. that
Yes.
while the European standard system is working for the single market, Scott, you put it really nicely,
Yes.
it's the industry response to a political drive.
Yes.
It's not the same thing, and so that enables us to continue as full member of Sen and Senelec,
Yes.
unless there's a really odd
Yes.
end result
Yes.
in the political
Yes.
game.
And that's where I think that it's important that our committee members, our nominating organisations, industrial associations and indeed consumer groups all help to, by trying to understand this issue of the importance of the single standard model in the UK, it helps to make the case for continued full membership of Sen and Senelec outside the EU. All that then continues and our trading opportunities are maximised.
Yeah. Just one final question that's come in about funding, and we know already that research organisations are slightly concerned, to say the least, about how Brexit will impact on universities. We've had a question in from Kostas Georgiopoulos about Eurocodes, particularly in university research, and we know that things like Horizon 2020, the EU's flagship innovation research scheme, there's a lot of standards that come out of that process. Do we see that is a potential risk for UK involvement?
Yes, it is. I mean, we are doing a huge amount of work on the role of standards in innovation, seen as an accelerator for translating research into commercial practice, very much an underused tool. And so, of course, given the excellent science and research background in the UK, this participation in cooperative standards development to accelerate innovation and research to practice is really, really important. So I do think it's another good example of an area where we need to make sure that building trust with investors, with regulators, through the use of voluntary standards in cooperation with science and technology experts in other countries is maintained.
Scott, Richard, thank you. We'll bring this webinar to a close. Just to summarise what you've heard today, BSI is in a business as usual situation, and you're the eyes and ears of the committees, so please tell us if you see anything in the committees that has changed since the 23rd or 24th of June, because certainly as a full member of Sen and Senelec we shouldn't have seen that. Our ambition is to continue on behalf of the UK as a full member of Sen and Senelec if and when the UK leaves the EU. And we believe, and the evidence backs this up, that this is really important for UK business and society in order to influence those European standards and to enable reciprocity of market access across 33 countries, regardless of what comes out of the discussions around the UK's future relationship with the EU. So thank you for tuning into this webinar. A version of this will be available on BSI's YouTube channel. If you have additional questions that haven't been answered today or you want further clarification, please send them in to the email address you see there, europeanpolicy@bsigroup.com, and you can see regular updates on the BSI website using the address you see there. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Richard. And thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.